Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about lethality in Total War Pharaoh Dynasties, one of the new features that Creative Assembly Sophia has added to the game in order to improve the battles. See, Total War for many years, not just the Saga games or Troy and Pharaoh, but Total War games in general have had a specific issue with battles. How do you make it so that you have on one hand elite units that are really strong, but on the other hand, you also have the capability of taking them down? Because fighting units to the death is not really a great experience, especially when you have situations where you can completely surround the unit and they'll just keep fighting and surviving for a very long time. Now, to be clear, Total War Pharaoh Dynasties does have issues, but I keep thinking about like Rome 1 or Medieval 2. Like, think about Rome 1. You could have really powerful elite units that would just get obliterated in seconds, dependent on the situation. Then you think of a game like Medieval 2, where things could be a bit too slow in terms of how the pacing of combat is. Now, people will always talk about realism, and generally it's some kind of argument about like, oh, real combat was slow. It was. But games in general, and media in general, is not really realistic about how they portray battles, for a number of reasons. This idea that we see in media a lot about like two armies marching against each other and fighting to the death for hours is complete and utter nonsense. The reason it's complete and utter nonsense is that's not how battles were actually fought. One of the things to be said about actual battles in history is that yes, a lot of people did die from them, but not during the actual fighting phase of it. Typically speaking, the vast majority of soldiers throughout all of history, with the exception of, when you're starting talking about World War I and World War II, but for a vast majority of human history, especially before the invention of gunpowder and its widespread usage, most soldiers did not die in battle. Like, you look at many battles with tons of soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers involved in them, maybe even hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and some of them, if you believe some of those records, historians have cast out on some of the more ridiculous numbers out there. But if you do believe the records, you see battles where you have massive armies fighting each other, and then only one side takes a lot of casualties, and the other walks out with you have a battle where one side loses tens of thousands of men, and another side loses maybe 1,000, 2,000, something along those lines, or a couple of thousands. But why does that happen? Well, that's because, historically speaking, most actual battles did not see most people actually die during the battle phase. Rather, it was wounds that soldiers took in a battle that eventually would kill them, especially because of infection, and generally lack of treatment. It was disease in general, even if people weren't wounded. I mean, antibiotics are a relatively recent invention, and before them, you could get a lot of nasty diseases that would kill a lot of otherwise healthy people just because they were participating in a war. And all the way up to the Napoleonic age and even beyond, most soldiers did not die in combat. Like Napoleon, for instance, did not lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers in Russia because of direct combat. Mostly, he lost them to disease, actually. I mean, the cold certainly didn't help, but it wasn't the cold directly, it was the disease. So that's one thing. Another thing to also mention is greater casualties, far greater casualties were inflicted on one army after combat was done. So in the pursuit phase. This was why pursuing an enemy was so important. So without cavalry, without the ability of pursuing an enemy, you would see far fewer casualties. This is why you get such lopsided outcomes in so many historical battles where one side defeats the other and then inflicts staggering losses on an opponent, is because of that pursuit, disease, wounds, so on and so forth. It wasn't the direct clash of units. Then you have the situation of how battles were actually fought, how the clash was. If you have this idea that armies would just line up against each other and they would stay there for hours, constantly fighting against each other, that's not how things would happen. Even in relation to Total War, one of the things that was mentioned on Tank Commanders many years ago was the fact that the way historians view things, and this is the best guess we do have at the moment, but the way historians view things is that battles would have been fought in bursts. Combat would have been fast, but you couldn't sustain combat for a very long period of time. People would tire out in a clash of it. That's why you have many accounts like push, pull, like even Thermopylae, like the way the Persians attacked the Greeks. Like the Greeks did hold their line, but the Persian would attack, counterattack, and even the Greeks there, like they would sometimes pull back, lure the enemy into attacking them, and then push them back. That is something that did happen. So from that perspective, by the way, anyone who talks about like slower paced battles need to understand how battles were actually fought. People could die very quickly, but actual battles were slower for that reason. Now, it would be great to have a game focused on that, but, lethality is there to solve another problem. A problem that, in particular, Troy and Pharaoh, and even, for instance, Britannia to some extent, have had. See, the issue with both Troy and Pharaoh is that they were really trying to make infantry combat, interesting. With Troy, they had this idea, we're going to have a bunch of different unit types, lighter infantry, heavier infantry. It didn't work out. The reason it didn't work out is because, heavier infantry just ended up winning in the battles that mattered, be it the choke points of sieges or minor settlements, or in the narrow battlefields that we did have, or the narrow battle maps that we did have and still have actually in the Aegean area. So that was one of the significant problems. Then, with the release of Pharaoh, they tried to spice it up. It's like climate severity, terrain, different battle maps. It again, didn't work out. Effectively, heavier infantry ended up dominating. And this was not great. It isn't great. The reason heavier infantry ended up dominating is for a couple of reasons. One, even if you had infantry that had a good amount of armor piercing good stats, it wouldn't matter, because if you have light infantry, they're going to be vulnerable to any kind of unit. Like even things like spearmen could defeat the light infantry unit, regardless of the damage dealing capability of that light infantry unit. So it ended up screwing over the balance completely and made a lot of characters and a lot of army rosters completely redundant. And it made it so that what you really wanted to do with every faction in the game is get the heaviest possible infantry that faction had available. And if you didn't have heavy infantry, you're going to get screwed. It also created an incentive structure in the campaign for a player to really push for the recruitment of the best possible infantry. And that, again, is not great. It just cheapened the entire experience in both battle and campaign. Well, now enter lethality. Lethality is an additional stat. Some people complain about it, but from my perspective, I'm going to tell you, I hated the battles of Pharaoh. I hated the battles of Troy. But now, here I am, fighting settlement battles, fighting field battles, and I got to tell you, I'm enjoying these a lot. Like, even on baseline levels, even when I'm not changing things like penalty of terrain, increasing penalty of terrain, which you can now do, and I'd recommend doing so, or morale for flanking, you're still in a situation where right now in Pharaoh, you are incentivized to actually have a variety of different units. You want decent line holders, but you want good flankers. You may want light infantry because of the speed that they have in battle, because if you can get a good line infantry unit to do a flanking attack or an attack properly on another enemy unit, regardless of how good that unit is, you are going to be able to inflict some serious damage and win the battle. Now, the morale by default is still a bit ridiculous. You can change not the morale necessarily, but the impact of morale actions. It can be a bit ridiculous sometimes if you set it to the highest level, like Flaming Archers just obliterating enemy morale, which is, ridiculous. But all the same, it is available. And lethality makes it so a lot more units that weren't useful before suddenly are far more useful. It makes battles more dynamic, it makes them more interesting, it actually adds tactics. So I gotta give it to CA Sophia. They have managed to solve a problem that has plagued Total War for years. And that problem is, how do we make pure infantry combat, not range combat, not cavalry combat, but pure range combat interesting? Though, pure melee combat interesting. Though it also benefits range combat as well, because suddenly you now have, chariots, skirmisher chariots that are actually useful in a battle because of lethality. They punch way above their weight, even though they don't have too many models. You also, and in virtually every other game, Total War game, like those kind of range skirmisher units can either be completely broken or and overpowered or completely useless. You now have the solid middle ground. With respect to cavalry and chariots, well, they're also significantly more useful than they were before. Like, I didn't think I would actually enjoy using chariots in Total War Pharaoh, especially considering how they were at launch. They were completely useless to use as units. They still have issues with regards to settlement battles, and don't get me started on sieges. Lethality can be described as a band-aid, but damn, just the sheer dynamic of battles that you now have compared to what existed before. Like, I'm having a lot more fun playing with light cavalry, horse archers, and charge cavalry, shock cavalry of the light variety, and using really Hunnic and Mongol tactics in this game far more so than I ever did in things like Attila or Medieval 2. Like, I hated using horse archers in Medieval 2. It wasn't really a fun experience. Like, for all the things that Medieval 2 does great, let's just say there were always issues in that particular title. So, as far as I see it here with CA Sofia, they really went to the drawing board. They tried a number of things. Those failed. Like, they tried variety of different units, terrain, all that. It is useful to have. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's not they weren't bad ideas, but they were missing something. Well, lethality is that missing ingredient. Now, could it be done in a different and potentially better way? Yeah, sure. It can always be argued. Some people will hate it, saying it's just a gimmick and all that. Some people will hate, like, spearmen with shields will just be killed by archers. But from a practical standpoint, when you're fighting an army, one army with another army, sure, it can trivialize certain aspects of combat, and the AI is not necessarily the best, but I gotta tell you, consider this battle. Sure, the morale impact is certainly higher, and I got lucky to kill the general. I wish, general impact, killing or keeping a general alive wasn't so significant, but, I'm just gonna say it outright. I am having a lot more fun with these battles than I would have ever expected. In fact, one of the things I was very skeptical with Total War Pharaoh Dynasties is okay, we're gonna add this campaign map. But what are we going to do to really improve battles? Well, apparently they did a lot. And I imagine it wasn't necessarily easy to come up with all of this. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.